So, hello and good day to you. This is David Lindo. I'm also known as the Urban Birder, and today I have a guest who I've got to know about over the last few months, having read his book, The Restless Coast, Roger Morgan-Grenville. But before I introduce myself to him and he says hello to us, I need to just give you the quick blurb when it comes to our sponsors. We're sponsored by Koa Sporting Optics, who are the manufacturers of the world-renowned Promenade series of spotting scopes, and also Birds, Wildlife and Nature, the tour company that strives to deliver the best of birding and wildlife watching opportunities throughout the world. So thank you very much, guys, for sponsoring us. So, Roger, how are you and where are you?
I'm very well, and I'm in Petworth, West Sussex. Not a million miles from you, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm actually at the moment on the south coast, of England. So basically, that's where I am. Um, Let me introduce you, Roger, because you are a writer, a speaker, and you're also a very vocal campaigner on conservation issues. Um, uh, what I'd like to find out from you is the very beginning, because I know that you haven't always been doing this. Can you just quickly give us a truncated, this is your life?
Yeah. I was introduced to nature. I was lucky enough. I had a sort of very rural upbringing, and my dad was into bird watching. But I think the real influence was my granny lived up in the Hebrides in the Isle of Mull, and I spent a lot of each summer up there. And we sort of basically went feral up there, and she just said, "Go and look at stuff," and the stuff to look at was birds. And I got sort of obsessed with one bird in particular, which was the shearwater. And years and years later, I wrote a book about it. But then I joined the army, spent 10 years in the army, unusually served in 5 continents, which was Europe, Africa, Asia, America, and Antarctica. Because after the Falklands War, I was down on South Georgia and ran that detachment, which was if you were a birder with 6 million penguins and everything else, that was heaven. When I left, I we had a little family company which I joined, which to be honest, which I spent 25 years at, and to be honest, was lovely enough. But I was never. I think it was better than me. I think I was never very commercial, and you have to be these days when you're running a company. So unusually, about 8 or 9 years ago, I sacked myself. Um, and because really what I wanted to do was hang off cliffs and look at seabirds um, and and I always say to people now, if you want to have a career in nature writing, for goodness sake, pay your mortgage off first, um, because it's very few people are going to pay their mortgage off doing nature writing. And then, in a way, what went alongside that was campaigning. As an ex-soldier, I got heavily involved in the startup of Help for Heroes during the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, because I'd seen violence and I'd seen death, and I kind of knew what happened when, if you were a 22-year-old soldier who'd lost a leg, yes, you'd get mended, but what happened then? And I think that campaigning thing has just gone on to nature now. So about 5 years ago, I teamed up with Mary Colwell and others and helped set up Curlew Action. And I think then my kind of thought at the moment is nature needs all the voices it can get. I mean, no, you're a heck of a voice for it, but we all have to be, and that's kind of where I am at the moment.
Well, I'm really sort of delighted that you were one of the co-founders of the Curlew Action group, because that's an amazing uh, group that's really done a lot of good work. And Mary Colwell is one of my heroes.
Me
So it's
too.
fantastic that that's happened. Um, but just going back to the beginning again, I mean, obviously you've made a transition from, being in the armed services and then working in your family business, and then becoming what you are now today, and still developing. Um, how did you know? I mean, one question I always find fascinating is, how did you know that you could write? How did you know that you had a voice? How did you get that first kind of opportunity or enlightenment to knowing that you could do that?
I think I've always been a bit of a show off, and writing was kind of the way, one of the ways I did that, because I've had this sort of, I think this happy skill of being able to write as I speak. And I think a lot of people, as soon as they get a pen in their hands or a keyboard below their hands, they communicate in a completely different way. Whereas I tend to sort of write as I speak, and I think that's probably easier to read. But I was writing when I was writing the most god awful poetry when I was in my teens, and but constantly needing to, every time I got blown out, well, every time something happened, I wrote this miserable poetry. But then it sort of changed, and I think the time I really realised was when I started beekeeping about a decade ago, and we had this little book with my friend Duncan, and we had this little book, this notebook where we said the condition of the hive and all the inspections. But then he picked it up one day and said, "You're writing a book." He said, "You don't know, you're not just writing that, you're writing all these incredible notes, and it's beautiful, and do something." And that then became, I sort of made a book proposal and a series of happy sliding doors moments. The book got published as Liquid Gold, and it kind of went from there. And I find that I just love writing, and I know so many people don't. But it's very, very, if you do, if you don't love writing and you have a career in writing, God help you. But if you do love writing, yeah, it's great, even when the muse goes and you're blocked. So yeah, I think when I go around and I do quite a lot of sort of talks in schools and things, and people say, "Oh, what do I do?" As if it's some kind of incredibly complicated thing. I just say, write. If you want to write a book, don't buy a book about writing a book. Just write, and then write some more. And this idea of writer's block, yeah, you can't have doctor's block or builder's block. Um, just write, and it'll probably be complete rubbish on those bad days, but it will get better and better and better, because you'll come back and revisit it. So that's how it happened. I think I just always wanted to write.
Yeah. I guess writer's block is when you actually are so focused on getting something out that looks perfect and reads well that you kind of think it, and then suddenly you can't think of anything that sounds good in your mind. When, as you say, it's just a question of getting stuff out on the sheet, isn't it?
Well, I find every now and again I sort of get little commissions from national newspaper to say. I had one the other day. It said, every autumn, all these tabloid things about rats getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're gonna take over, and it's all awful. And someone said, "Can you write a pro-rat article?" And I don't know any more about rats than anyone else. But I said, "How long have I got?" And they said 2 hours. And that was so easy, because if they'd said 2 months or 2 weeks, I would have bought 8 books on rats and really confused myself. But it was 2 hours. And I just said, well, the reason you got lots of rats is we are terrible little lads. And the reason the rats are getting bigger and bigger is so much of that litter is protein in the form of fast food. And I wrote this, and it was incredibly easy. Whereas if I'd had lots of, I think you're very fortunate as a writer if you work well under pressure, and I do. I need a deadline. If someone says, "Oh yeah, send it in about a year," about 3 days before I'll write it.
Yeah, I think I'm like you really. Um, we're here to talk about your your latest book, which is called The Restless Coast, which is a fantastic book. In fact, I wrote a few notes. I mean, this is the whole thing about in conservation with. And by the way, if you are watching this for the first time, In Conservation is a series of Zoom interviews in which I speak to movers and shakers within the world of natural history. And some of these people are not even, ecologists or scientists or even involved in conservation full time. They might have touched on it in a profound way that, we need to talk about. But reading your book, and I want to talk to you about this book, but also the one before that led to this book. My notes, I mean, I've said that basically you literally walk the coast and you meet and discuss the state of the sea and the coast and its wildlife with local naturalists, businesses, and other people. And you're dedicated, which I love, to looking at both sides of the controversy, not just this is terrible for nature, but obviously a lot of it is. But I mean, to look on both sides and get both sides of the argument. And you frequently, as far as I can see, make the point that selfish human needs and preferences should not be allowed to destroy our nature effectively. And you take the long view that in geological terms, obviously humankind has been around just for a blink of an eye, but the planet has always been changing, always will be changing. And I think you very eloquently discuss the idea of the defense of the natural world, which I think is great. So it's very articulate and a very conversational style you got there to bring across this really interesting idea of walking around the coasts. But prior to that, back in 2022, I believe, you had an idea to walk basically through the country again to look at as I've got here to look at the or to highlight the decline in nature in the UK. What Before we talk about the coast, what kind of made you want to do this initial walk through Britain?
Well, I think yes, it was to highlight the decline, but also it was to highlight the hope. And I think one of the things that underpins everything I write is think about a Venn diagram, and you have two circles, and one is anger and one is hope. And without each other, they're useless. But if you push them together, the bit in the middle is activism. And we kid ourselves that activism has to be, like Just Stop Oil, getting out in the streets and writing, whatever. It doesn't. Activism is what you build into the architecture of your daily life. So I had this idea. I've walked all my life. I've walked and walked and walked thousands of miles, and I thought the one thing apart from writing I'm quite good at is walking. So why don't I combine the two? And I never wanted to walk from Land's End to John O'Groats, but I quite fancied
Why not?
walking from Lymington to Cape Wrath, and to look at different habitats and to maybe pick one project in each and say what's going on. And I ended up incredibly hopeful, angry and hopeful, because there's so much good going on. And if only we can, I come back to this time and time again, if only we could tame the idiots, then we could actually get somewhere. And it was it was a 1,000-mile walk in 55 days. And and I remember walking one day with an evolutionary biologist who said, I bet all your friends are really impressed with you. And I went, yeah. And he said, I'm not. And I was quite offended. And he said, because you're doing what your body evolved to do. And pre-agrarian man, go back 17, 18,000 years. We were evolved. We were the only ape with transversally and laterally, longitudinally arched feet, which means we evolved to make long journeys. And I just got fitter and fitter and fitter. And I was 62 at the time. So, and all my friends were thinking, he's going to flake, he's going to flake. But I didn't. And then I got up to Cape Wrath. And if you've ever done a really long journey on foot, one of the issues is that you get into a state of grief at the end, because far from this thing of, oh God, I've achieved it, that's fantastic, look at me. You go, you've never had freedom like that for 55 days, and then suddenly it's over and you're back to normal, and you've got to pay the bills and all the rest. But I looked out from Cape Wrath and I thought, I haven't written anything about the sea. And so I I came up with this idea. I mean, the coast is 11,000 miles, and I couldn't do that. But I thought, well, I'm going to do 13 or 14 150-mile walks, and each one I'm just going to look at something different. And by the end of it, I'll know the coast better. Um, and no, the even in the research phase, what I found astonished me, which was that we've fallen out of love with our coast. Just as simple as that. We're an island. And so what I wanted to do was reconnect with my inner islander. Um, and it was I mean, we're very strange. We're the only country in Europe with a coastline where wealth has migrated away from the coast. And in many, many cases, poverty and deprivation and age have migrated to the coast. And I think it's sort of one thing, it dates back to the Beaching Acts, where he closed a lot of the branch lines that brought people down to these coastal resorts, and they just died. And so one of the constant themes in my journey was actually a lot of nature's doing quite well. It's the humans who aren't. And one of my criticisms of our tribe, you know, you and me, is that a lot of us are incredibly rude about our own species, and I don't think that's the way we should be. I think we are a species. We deserve to be happy, and we deserve, where we do things right, to be praised. So, kind of that's what I try and do, is where I found good things, just praise them. So yes, it was something that I decided on the last day of the previous walk to do the next one.
You two things that came out of that: fallen out of love with our coasts. Um, can you explain that? Because I see people, they're very coveted about the coast often. I mean, the coastline behind me is an area of West Sussex, which is basically private. You know, you can't go there unless you're a resident of the neighborhood, joining the sea. And then you go to coastlines like, for example, the other day I was in Southend. I know it's in Essex. It's a bit of a sort of a downtrodden place in many respects. Um, but when you say falling out of love, is that because I feel that people love being by the seaside? You know, everyone talks about we need to go to the seaside when the sun comes out, and you know, you still have the romantic sort of idea of seagulls, gulls flying above your head, and candy floss and ice cream. Am I kind of thinking along the wrong lines in terms of what you mean by falling out of love?
I think, no, not the wrong lines, but I think you're looking at quite a narrow group who still go there and appreciate it. And I think one of the problems was when the Beaching Acts fell in the early 60s, very quickly cheap flights to the more reliable sun of Spain and Italy and places started. And so people replaced the beaches in their own island with beaches in these other places. And the falling out of love, I think the sort of highlight of our love affair with the coast was probably in the 20s and 30s, where there was this sort of, apart from anything, it was this sort of area, this idea of a great sexual license and fun stuff, and the boarding house holiday. And I'm just old enough to remember, so I was sort of in the mid 60s when I was 5 or 6. We used to go to a boarding house in the Isle of Wight, and she was miserable. But actually, looking back at it, that was kind of how we all fell in love with the coast. But I think it's like, I tell you, that the thing that really staggered me was the expression I heard over and over and over again was used to be. That no one ever said will be or is. They all just talked about used to be. And so in Scarborough, which is a wonderful place, I was in this boarding house, old fashioned sort of, they don't call them boarding house anymore. And I tell you, the breakfast room could have taken 70 or 80 people, and there was just me in it. and it was just such a metaphor for what had gone. And I thought, well, one of my hopes for the book, and I never started like this, one of my hopes for the book is that it will reignite people's love for it. And then the other thing you mentioned, David, is this thing of um, Mark Cocker taught me, and I know you know Mark, of human exceptionalism, that basically everything has to work for every human being before it works for the first animal or bird. And somehow we've got to get away from that. We have to say that nature's not just a nice to have. Without nature, we die. And I think that's what people, no, I think that's what people like you and I have this opportunity for saying that over and over again. And sometimes it sticks, you know, and I'm sure you go to do far more talks than I do. And there must be a moment when you go to schools and things and you see someone's eye, you've got them.
Yeah,
And that is such a big moment because they will then evangelize to other people.
exactly. I love the idea that that phrase used to be, because I found myself for years saying used to be. Like, for example, my local patch in West London, Wormwood Scrubs, it used to be much better than what it was when HS2 and all those guys suddenly piled in and started destroying it. But then you're right, because we need to think about things. Okay, this is how it is. Let's make it better, as opposed to harking back to the past the whole time, because you can never get the past back. You need to, I guess, build a new future.
Absolutely. And my kind of, you know, I'm not an expert, but my read of the coast, having spent sort of 18 months on this on and off journey, is that it's there waiting for us. You know, much of it is in the same pristine condition as it was. And that, you know, the coast behind you in Hove is not degraded much. You know, there's been a bit of sea level rise, there's been a bit of realignment. And but basically, I mean, I was staggered by the Northumberland. I'd never really walked that Northumberland coast path, and I was staggered by Cardigan Bay because I'd never walked that before. And all these places, they aren't degraded; they're just empty. And we could go back there. And I think that whoever it was, Baba Dune or someone, you know, if you don't understand something, you can't love it, and if you can't love it, you can't care for it. And I think that there is quite a lot of neglect and the in our coast, um, and I just think that this sounds really stupid, but if you could start a movement to say actually our coast is wonderful, and I've spent time all the way down Europe in on the coast of Denmark and Holland, Germany and Holland and Belgium and France, and basically it's all dunes. It's a shore and it's a dune. Our coast is infinitely varied. It's got basalt cliffs and chalk cliffs and estuaries and all this stuff. And so no, really what I'm saying is nothing more complicated than we just it would be so good to go out and love it again.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, going to Southend, as I mentioned earlier, for those who don't know Southend, it's in Essex, just I guess in the mouth of the estuary of the Thames, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, and it's, in your mind, you think it's run down. I remember going to a cafe in the morning, which jutted out into the sea, but the sea was out, so we had a low tide, and there were a whole ton of gulls and raiders. I was like, where? I should have brought my binoculars. I didn't realize I'd be seeing so many. I was watching Mediterranean gulls flying around and flocks of dunlin, and sandling, which I never expected. So yeah, I think it's that discovery, I suppose. I mean, when you started your walks for this book, um, how did you actually? I mean, we'll talk about some specific elements of the book shortly, but how did you plan it? I mean, you're based in Sussex. What did you think? I'll start in Sussex, and then next weekend I'll go. I mean, was it a weekend thing? I mean, how
No,
long?
no, no. I was sort of was doing basically 150-mile walks, and I kind of tend to walk about 20 miles a day. So there were sort of 8, 9 day sections, and I think that reason behind that, that only I find if I could immerse myself in something. So, for example, the first I started where I finished the last book. I started at Cape Wrath, and I walked down the coast to Ullapool and then went across to the outer islands, looking at salmon farming. But by the end of that, I'd probably had 500 conversations about salmon farming, varied between campaigners who absolutely loathed it to people who realized it was keeping their local primary school open. And I just thought, I was someone I hadn't eaten salmon, farmed salmon for 7 years. And I was testing the question saying, should I? And but in that time, in that kind of 10-day period, I learned a lot. And I felt by the end, I was able to make quite a fair judgment about it. I mean, many people won't agree with me, but the fact is, at the end of the book, I still don't eat farm salmon because, for all the good things about it, it's just done in a way that is terrible for nature. And I think they can make it better. Whether they will or not, I don't know. But so what happens is you immerse yourself into this. But the interesting thing was no salmon farm wanted me anywhere near it because, journalists, writers, you're going to write horrible things. And so I wrote to the chief executive of Salmon Scotland. And to be fair to him, because I just said, I'm going to write this chapter and it's going to be awful because you're not talking to me. So all I'm going to do is represent the views of the other side. And they arranged for me to go on to a farm of my own choice. They didn't say you have to go to this one. And there were really good people running it. And they said, yeah, look, it's not perfect. So by the end of that thing, I had quite a good idea of what it was like. But so what I did is I just pieced the island into about 13 of those walks, and then almost let the book write itself. Let's just see what I see when I get there.
Yeah. Did you find during your journeys that your opinion was changed in a way that you didn't expect? I mean, for example, the salmon farming people, did they turn your head slightly in terms of how you originally thought to what happened after you spoke to them?
Yeah, I think that in a way they made me much more aware of my responsibility to tell a fair story. That it would be so easy to have just finished the thing and said, salmon farming is awful, this is what it does, this is the damage it does, we should ban it. But actually, if you go into a community centre, if you go into a primary school that is kept open by the presence of a well-paid crew from the salmon thing, it's very difficult. And so, and so I think what happened, certainly on both books, what happened is I was less sure by the end of each book about almost everything than I was at the beginning. And I think that's a strength. I think one of the problems we've got in nature and conservation in Britain is that we've all got these incredibly strong opinions, not always backed by fact. And that actually, if we spend less time telling other people they're wrong and more time saying, well, look, tell me what you think,
Yeah.
then what normally happens, and you can take anything like beavers or grouse shooting or deer management or whatever, you can find, if you talk to both sides, you will come up with a fair view. And often the annoying answer is in that grey bit in the middle. And all the people on the right to roam is a classic one. There are really strong arguments on both sides, but you don't need to camp in one side or the other. You can actually say, well, let's see where we agree and accept where we differ. And I think we're really bad at that in this country. I don't know if we're bad at this in every country, but it's and my point is we can't afford to be bad at it. We actually have to listen to listen to people, and you can have your opinion, but please respect other people's. That's where I ended up in most cases. No, I mean, as you know, you've read the book. There were a couple of cases where I went, no.
Yeah, because I think that's a really great point you make because I went to Malta a couple of years ago and I actually went as a guest of the British Guild of Travel Writers for whom I'm a member or with whom I'm a member, and it was at AGM. And I said to the people that organised it, "Do you know what goes on in this island?" You know,
Good for you.
"Oh, no." And then I explained it. But then one of them turned around and said, "Well, you should be out there shouting, you're a conservationist." And I said, "Well, but it doesn't work that way. Like you said earlier, conservation works across all different fronts. You've got the people who are out there in the front line with their, placards and stuff. And there's other people who want to talk to both sides. And I actually was very interested and wanted to actually speak to hunters and ask them why. Why'd you do it? I really want to understand why.
Did
And
you manage to?
yeah, I spoke to several hunters and plus families, people whose fathers or grandfathers used to hunt. And when, for example, the EU said that trapping was illegal, how some of those people became very depressed and wanted
Mm.
to commit suicide. And you kind of think, I don't understand. You're doing something really horrible, but then I realized, having spoken to these people, that they are this sort of negative side of me in a way, in that I watch birds and that's my pleasure. They shoot and kill birds and that's their pleasure. And if you take that away from them, then they have no pleasure. You tell me I can't watch birds anymore, I have no pleasure. Yeah, I know obviously it is a bit of a chalk and cheese scenario because you either go for chalk or cheese, but you can understand the mentality. And I think, reading your book, it's really interesting to know that you met with people who are supposedly on our side of the fence, but you kind of think, well, hang on a minute, are you listening? You're just talking about one thing, but not even weighing up the whole sort of picture. And
Yeah,
that's a really important point to make, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. And there's a really good example of um, th- when I wrote a chapter on plastic, and it's sort of basically based in Cornwall, because that's where Surfers Against Sewage is. And I'd sort of clocked that um, Penzance was the first plastic-free town in Britain. And I'm quite cynical about these things. I always think what that probably consists of six very well-meaning people sitting in a coffee shop saying we're going to change the world, and everyone else ignoring them. So I went to Penzance about a day before, and I went into every single shop on the high street, and I said, "Oh, can I have a plastic bag, please? Can I have a plastic cup? Can I have a plastic bottle?" And they all said, "No, absolutely not." Um, so when I interviewed them the next day, they said, look, what we did, and it's so different from how we run things in Britain normally. What we did, we did no big PR, no big sort of shout out, hey, we're going to be plastic free. We spent 2 years going around all the stakeholders we needed on side, the businesses, the schools, the churches, the sports clubs, and we got them on side. And only when we got everyone on side did we announce very quietly, this is what we're going to do. No big front banner headline. And that is such a good way of doing it. So when they set it up, everyone was up for it. And they've done incredibly well. And I think, you look at our politicians and everything has to be a soundbite. So you before anything's happened, you go, we're going to make whatever it is. Whereas what they'd done is go, we're going to say nothing. We're just going to do it. And it will be brilliant. And we need more of that, because the that it's so effective. And it's the same when I saw this project up in Ardfern, sort of south of Oban, where the Loch Craignish had been sort of destroyed by the seabed had been destroyed by trawling and scallop dredging and power boats and everything. And the community just said, we're not going to wait for money, we're not going to wait for permission, we're going to mend it. And so the 5 years before anyone gave them any money, they were at it, putting plugs of seagrass in. And I like those people. I like those initiatives that don't have big glossy brochures and don't have huge, great fundraising things, where they just go, no, we're going to do it. And I love them when they're local, when they buy in. The reason when I went out with that guy in his boat. The reason we stopped was he was doing a talk to the local primary school about saving the seabed. What a great reason to stop a meeting with a writer. And 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 so I think we one of the things we have to learn, that it's about doing, not talking. I don't know how we learn that, but we've got to do it.
Yeah, so great thing to say. Just as a quick aside, I mean, I have a problem with the UK and how we talk about conservation. My problem is that I feel that often it's one or two voices that supposedly speak on behalf of everyone. And that worries me because, as with any conversation, there's going to be different opinions. But for some reason, I feel that with the conservation world, there seems to be one or two people that kind of are foisted up there and are the spokespeople, spokesmen usually.
Yes.
And I don't like that because sometimes these people say things that I don't agree with. And also, I don't like it because I feel that the person on the street who's not connected to all of this and who is being spoken to thinks, well, all of you guys are the same. You know, all of you guys would sit in the middle of the M4 or
Yeah.
M25.
Absolutely.
And it goes back to what we talked about earlier about the way we actually um, act or do conservation, as it were. Do you feel the same way about that? Does that?
I think you're so right, and it's kind of almost, there's one line, there's one acceptable line, and it's kind of interesting. The meat eating is a classic thing, where a few years ago, the beginning of COVID, my younger son came back home from university as a vegetarian, and he said, "Well, if you watch Cowspiracy, you'll become a vegetarian as well." And I watched Cowspiracy, and I thought, well, if this is true, I should. So I then spent a year writing this book on cattle, working on a cattle farm, knocking around, and actually, it was complete. What they'd said in that film was, no, very largely very debatable, and some of them were outrageously wrong. And I still eat meat, but I eat it in a very different way. But I completely respect anyone's dietary choice. I just think I have a duty not to make people feel bad about what they're eating. And I particularly feel that because we've got, something like 21% of our teenagers have some kind of eating disorder. And if you just make them anxious about eating, just say, eat whatever makes you happy. And but I think you're absolutely right, David, that we there are too few voices, and too few, and they're not challenged enough. And I love the fact, I'm probably like you, I love a good argument, but it's never a cross shouty argument. It's, look, okay, and that's great, but it's when you're not prepared to have the argument. And I think social media does huge harm because it produces an echo chamber for people's established views. So if you begin by thinking X, the echo chamber, by the end of it, you'll be thinking 2X rather than, well, maybe there's another view. The one thing that social media is good at, I think, is something like Instagram, is inspiring people with pictures of nature. But everything else about it, I think, is just grim.
Excuse me. Talking about Grim, one of the things you touched on quite heavily actually was the bay of sewage. It made me feel so sad because when I hear the idea that people are out in the sea swimming amongst all that detritus, having to get an app to tell you when's the best time to swim if there's, less sewage than there is normally. Can you kind of briefly tell us about what you wrote?
Yeah, well, it was, and it really pained me because it's my local patch, and the when I looked at walking through my own coastline, I had two things I could write about. One was the amazing Solent Seascape project, which you'll know all about, which is fantastic. And the other is sewage. And sadly, the logical thing to talk about was sewage. And Langston Harbour, which you'll know because it's a great place to go birding, is also home to the Buds Farm outflow, where Southern Water pump crap out into the Langston Harbour. And actually, one of the great things I learned, and this is one of those chapters which should have been awful but wasn't, because there were about 25 or 26 protest groups who were all cross-minded. They're concerned mothers, paddleboarders, wild swimmers, kayakers, sailors. And they were all going, it's a great British thing of going, I'm so angry I could almost do something. And that's, they didn't do anything. And these two guys, Kevin and Rob, said, this is useless. Let's all get together for one protest group. And they raised £70,000, I think. And they got two scientists to teach them how to test water properly. So it's totally fact-based. It's not driven by emotion. Most of our debates, a lot of our debates about nature in this country are driven by emotion. This was driven by fact. So when Southern Water said, this is clean, they could go along and go, no, it's not. We are actually testing this water to a higher degree than you are. And you know, it's working. And I think that, I mean, interestingly, when I said to Southern Water, like I said to the salmon industry, can I have, I want to have an interview, but I'm only prepared to interview a main board director and on the record, not because I'm a big important guy, but because that's what I needed. And about a month later, I got an off the record interview with a junior person in the comms department. And the, you know, in a way, and what I say in the book is, don't take my word for it, just read the judge's summing up when he finds Southern Water 90 million quid in 2021. And he uses the word criminal over and over again, which actually, as an author, allowed me to use the word criminal in the book without lawyers looking at it. But where I go after that is, let's give Southern Water a chance. If we just harry these water companies until, no, what's the end product for us? Let's say, right, we've told you, we've caught you out, you've got to sort it. Because actually, what I learned in that process was there's a much bigger problem down the line, which is we're running out of water and no one's talking about it. And no one's talking about it because through various regulations, the government actually is stopping people talking about it because it's uncomfortable. We don't like uncomfortable things. So yeah, it was very dispiriting, but equally, and the one thing I ended up, I think I put in the book, when those two guys, idiots who cut down the sycamore in Sycamore Gap, went down for 4 years for cutting down a tree, and yet none of these directors who put millions and millions of tons of sewage illegally into the system, none of them are in prison. And I've sort of always, I say sort of slightly tongue in cheek, if you just put one of them in prison for something egregious, it'll be amazing how much of a signal that will send around to the others.
Okay.
But I ended up quite optimistic because I think, you know, it's 40 wasted years that all these, the government, when they privatized, they never put in regulation strict enough. And so all these dividends were put offshore. But I think there will be a better world. It's disgraceful where we are, but I think it will get better. I do think what we need to talk about is running out of water.
That could be another subject for another In Conservation With, I think.
Actually, I'll tell you what, one thing that's interesting. I interviewed Southern Water the other day, writing an article about it. And I said, what happens when they do these 2,000 house developments? And they said, we are statutorily not allowed to object. Even if we know we cannot supply the water they need, we are not allowed to object. You know, that is bonkers.
Yeah. This is all very smelly. I mean, in more ways than one. I mean,
Yes.
the way that things are working, the way the government. I don't want to talk too much about politics, but I'm very disappointed with the current
Mm.
Labour government. I was really hoping that they would, hold carry the baton for conservation and for keeping the environment good. But it's all about the dollar bill, isn't it? It's all about a dollar bill, y'all.
Well, and I think also that what none of the I'm a fan of politicians. I think if we just go on being rude about all our politicians, they'll get worse and worse and worse. We've got to, somehow try and encourage good people to go and do it. But this goes back to human exceptionalism, that they they keep thinking that when they talk about growth, what do they mean? They mean growth of consumption. They don't mean growth of fairness. They don't mean growth of quality of life. They mean more cars, more aeroplanes, more buildings, more containers. And it's illusory that all these prime ministers say at some point, we can have net zero by 2050 with no change to our lifestyle. And it's completely untrue. And they know it's untrue. That actually, what we need is a fairer society where people have more of us have enough to get by on, but also to understand that less isn't a bad thing. And so when Rachel Reeves says we're going to ban the blockers and we're going to ignore bats and newts and whatever, what she's actually saying is deeply cynical. But I'm with you. I don't want to get stuck on it, but I'm very disappointed as well.
Just to change the subject completely, tell me about Bardsey Island. Uh,
Oh,
it's a
the
place.
island of 20,000 saints. Um, well, it's, as you know, it's off the sort of the northern peninsula of Wales, the Lhen Peninsula. And like you, I know we were talking earlier, I had tried 4 times to get there. And each time I got done by COVID and then storms and then something else. And I finally got there when I was writing this book. And I'd originally planned to go to just 2 islands. And I think I ended up going to 38 because, and Bardsey was classic, that these islands are what we call thin places where the gap between the physical world and the kind of metaphysical world is at its thinnest. And you don't need to be religious to see this. And I now understand completely why these early Christian sort of apostles came and based themselves on islands like Lindisfarne or Iona or Bardsey, because there's something about them. And I kind of, in spite of myself, I went to Bardsey and I just thought, this is wonderful. And apart from anything, the shearwater is my favourite bird, and they've got loads of shearwaters there. But one of the things that really surprised me was when I went there, and no one lives there permanently, but there's some holiday houses. And I came around a corner and there was this priest sitting giving away his paintings. And we're British, we get terribly embarrassed when someone's trying to give us something. And he said, look, it's not going to bite, that's what I do. And I said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, we have a rotating chaplaincy on this island. And he said, basically, I spend 50 weeks of the year ministering to pissed off Amazon workers in Peterborough. And then for 2 weeks of the year, I come here and I minister to whoever feels like turning up. And he said, it is amazing. I watch the effect on people who come to this island. He said, I'm not claiming I do anything, but I can tell you one thing, when they leave the island, they are so much calmer than they were when they got here. So that's another great advertisement for the coast. And Bards is, a lot of islands are, somewhere like Skye is incredibly busy, and some of them has got a bridge to it. All these islands are very different, but Bardsey, it's still even maybe only a mile from the coast, but what a mile! That is really churning water. So very often you can't get there, and that's the fun of an island. You can't. No, you have no guarantee getting there or getting off it. You need to go there.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I got stumped by COVID, unfortunately, in terms of COVID stopping me from getting there because of the travel restrictions. But I'm a big one for islands. So, Roger, I mean, your book, The Restless Coast, a must read, I must say. It is a must read, even. Um, but what I want to say or ask you is, you talk about a positive outcome. What is that outcome in your view?
I think that there's two outcomes. One is for just people to understand what a jewel they've got, um, and to appreciate it and love it. Because I think if we love it, it will get better. And I, I was a soldier, and I saw a lot of deprivation, but I've never seen hopelessness like I've seen in some of these seaside towns. And I think that to try and get full-time jobs and to get people to take the coast seriously. But the other thing is to celebrate. I, I want to celebrate the good things that are going on, and particularly for young people, because if all we ever do is tell them the bad news, then eventually they're just going to turn around and go, well,
That's the point.
what's the point? Whereas if you say, but look, I mean, there's a sort of a good example I use from the previous book where I this 70-year-old lady kept emailing me saying, can I come and walk with you in Derbyshire? And I was really fit and I didn't want to walk with anyone who held me up. But eventually I said, okay, yeah. She was much fitter than I was. And her retirement present to herself had been um, a, a 13-acre degraded peat bog in the Peak District. And she said she spent £40,000 on it. And she said, all I want to do the rest of my life is make it better. So every Saturday and Sunday, on her own or with friends, she goes up and she does a bit of redamming or puts a plug of sphagnum moss. And then, a year later, she said, I got the curlew back. And then 2 years later, she emailed me and said, I got the red shank and the snipe and the golden plover. That's one person. And we kid ourselves in this country that it takes millions of pounds and hundreds of years and loads of people to change it. That's climate change. Nature loss, you can change it with one person in a year. And you've seen that, and I've seen that. And it's to get that message across that if we can be part of these things, particularly volunteers, I think young people volunteering. So what I'd love for the book to do is just tell people they've got an amazing coastline and to spend time on it. So that they can love it like we do.
Well, I think that's a brilliant message, Roger. And I think anyone watching this episode of In Conservation with, rush down to your local shop, or if you have to go on Amazon and get this book, The Restless Coast. It's fantastic. Um, Two quick questions, Roger. If I were to ask you what your favorite animal was, what would you say it'd be?
It changes. Right now, it's a Tamworth pig. I do. I have a lovely part-time job as a wildlife guide at Net Rewilding, and one of the joys of my spring and summer and autumn has been the Tamworth pigs. And the only rule I make when I take groups out is they're not allowed to use the word cute. But my goodness, when you've got those small piglets, it's tough not to. But I think there's lots of reasons for that, but they are fantastic. But what I love is they are biodiversity engineers in action, and you can see once they decide a place is worth digging up, that that's going to be the seed bed that's going to bring in the arable weeds and then the brambles and then the thorns and then finally the trees. And so those pigs started all. So I'm going to go for the Tamworth pig.
Okay, well, I'm going to come definitely and see you in Nep, but
Please
I
do.
must warn you, I'm an ambler, not a rambler.
That's fine. You're allowed to be.
And if you could be anywhere on this planet right now, where would you be?
I've always, for 40 years, I've always said South Georgia because I was a soldier down in the Antarctic, and it was the professionally the most wonderful time of my life, because it was me and 41 soldiers. The nearest commanding officer was 900 miles away. And I had 6 million penguins and about 1 million albatrosses. I think I've changed. I think the experience of these two books has changed me. And probably, where would I be? I'd be on the west coast of Mull, somewhere down where my granny lived, down sort of Benesson or Finnefort. And I'd just be maybe sitting with a pint in Finnefort, looking at the stuff flying by. So there you go. Isle of Mull.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Roger, thank you so much for sparing your time to be with us today here on In Conservation With.
Huge pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I wish you all the best for the book. Fantastic book, The Restless Coast. And anyway, for those who are watching in the future, please like and subscribe in Conservation With. Tell all your friends about it. Tell a few of the people you don't like as well, because they might become better people. And I hope that we can meet again on a future episode of In Conservation With. So thank you very much, guys. And don't forget, keep looking up.